Well, good morning, everyone. And this is my great pleasure to start the annual virtual climate change symposium at the GVSU Student Scholar Day. So our program is in the chat, and you can see that we have 4 presentations featuring excellence of student research on climate change and climate solutions. We are going to start by the presentation by Poynter and Hannah Zylman. We will continue with the presentation by Julia Shreve at 10:30. We will then continue with the next presentation by Jess Goodyear at 11 o'clock. And we will conclude at 11:30 with a presentation by Leah Anderson and Kristin Davis. So every speaker will have about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for the question and answers, and a little bit of time for transition for the next presentation. So at any moment, if you have any questions, you can send them through the Q&A, and I will moderate the interaction between the audience and the presenters. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Kate and Hannah. It is my great pleasure working with them the entire year. Both Hannah and Kate are MOBI fellows at Johnson Center for Philanthropy, and we have been working the entire year exploring equitable and inclusive climate adaptation planning solutions in Michigan City. So I am very pleased to introduce and share the screen with Kate and Hannah, who are presenting together.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice of you to join us. We're going to go ahead and share our screen to start our presentation. All right, so yeah, as Elena said before, we're doing a study on equitable and inclusive climate change adaptation planning. I'm Hannah. And I'm Kate. So what we've been looking into is analyzing how the climate action plans across the upper Midwest have included adaptation planning strategies along with their equitable actions and the diversity and inclusion efforts within all of the plans that they have written. And then in the future, we hope this will help establish a foundation for those climate adaptation plans in other cities and improving them with more equitability, so that we're looking at in motivators, goals, and funding and how that's all included in their planning. The focus for what we've been reading is including 9 climate action plans and some adaptation plans as well, but it covers 7 different cities. And all of the plans that we found for our methodology was through public. They're all public. They're open to the public through all of their plans. So we just got those off of most of the city websites and we're able to read them from there and then grade it based on what we read from it. So the system that we created in order to grade it and look at the equitability for the different cities with those 9 different plans in the 7 different cities was we came up with 2 grading criteria and our rubric, and we looked at in dividing the equity-centered actions as well as the diversity inclusion. So their equity-centered actions are more of what plans and steps they're taking for sustainability and renewable efforts, but they were also looking at how diverse and inclusive their planning and what groups they were able to include for participation. And then within that rubric, it was kind of a 5-tiered system that Kate will explain.
Yeah, so here's the grading system we have. As Hannah said, it's separated into equity-centered actions and diversity inclusion. For the equity-centered actions, it's 5-tiered, so we have 0 to 4. 0 means there's no planning domain present, whereas a 4 means that there's actual strategies, a plan, and they're currently achieving something within the plan. Whereas a 2, it's more so it's mentioned that they're interested in it, but nothing's really happening yet. But it's an idea, it's a goal of their plan. As for the diversity inclusion, it's more or less looking at the efforts people have put into the plan, the inclusion aspect more or less. 0 is none and 4 is an author, and we also have participant, content creator, and collaborator, all have varying levels of participation within the plan.
So then again, for our assessment rubric, where we were giving them a grade and on a number scale, that 5-tiered system, the way that we divided it up was into equity-centered actions and diversity and inclusion, like we've said, but we even further divided it where we were looking at the specifics of those types of actions and how we could grade them and looking into more of what parts they were including. So for equity-centered actions, we were looking at the equitability specifically, and not just if they were included in the plans, but for more of wellness and health side of planning, and then with security for energy and air and water quality, as well as more just access to some natural-based services that are all important for cities, especially with trying to be more green. And then for diversity and inclusion of stakeholder participation, we were really looking at the minorities and other vulnerable groups and how they're including those with their participation, and what variety of groups are being included in planning, and not just having the main city planners, but what other groups are included in coming up with ideas and what's important for the plans. Then for breaking it down and what our actual data came out as, you can kind of see we have the equity-centered actions, and there were totaled, if you were able to get a 4 on every single point that we talked about, you would get a total out of 56. So the grading for Chicago was definitely the highest. They were kind of our example city with 44 out of the 56 possible. And then there's other cities in here that are along the scale, and some that you can see are working on the possibility of improving their kind of score. Then for diversity and inclusion, this was out of 48, as there were only 12 rather than the 14 for equity-centered actions. The 12 different possibilities of what kind of stakeholders and groups that they could include in their plan. And again, Chicago did pretty well, but Detroit actually was the most inclusive as far as what they were able to participate. What? And oh yeah, Ann Arbor was the highest one, and Detroit was also extremely high in that because they're both pretty diverse areas, so they included more participation in their plans.
So So right here we have the assessment comparisons. As Hannah was noting before, a lot of plans did better and a lot of plans did worse in comparison. As for the equity-centered actions, Chicago CAP, they were overall the best, hitting almost 80% with that grading system in comparison to a lot of the other cities, which are more smaller Michigan cities. And then the diversity inclusion, we had Detroit and Ann Arbor. They were both very similar in their ratings, which personally to me was very shocking to see that those two were specifically the highest rather than Chicago in comparison to its equity-centered actions. So now we're going to dive into the specific ratings and what they mean, and we're going to be comparing the information and data through some radar graphs. So right here, we have the Chicago CAP. On the left, we have diversity inclusion, and on the right, we have equity-centered actions. Again, with Chicago CAP, as I mentioned before with that bar graph, they had a pretty high percentage, and that reflects the radar graph. It's a very well-rounded system that's showing that they're putting efforts into everything. They don't have a single thing that's not noted or just even mentioned. Like everything has effort, and they're making plans to execute those things. As for the diversity inclusion, it doesn't necessarily reflect their equity-centered actions. However, they are putting a lot of efforts in their city planning services and their local elected officials, which I'm sure will eventually reflect a lot of the other information and data that we collected within the CAP. The Resilient Chicago Plan, this was another plan that Chicago provided. And it's very interesting because the diversity inclusion appears to be on a separate spectrum. They're focusing more on the energy, the health and wellness, and the accessibility of services that people have within their city. As for the equity-centered actions, they're not really focusing that much on things, but still regardless, that CAP plan really reflects a lot of efforts being put forth.
Just as a quick note between the two, they're both for Chicago, but they have different focuses between the two plans.
Mm-hmm. And right here is Detroit. Their equity-centered actions, not as well-rounded as Chicago's, but they still have some efforts, mostly going towards business, economic activity, and education, which are both very important factors within a city and, becoming more sustainable and more resilient. And then their diversity inclusion, which I personally found very interesting about this, was a lot of the things are targeted at things that are going to help the local community, like local businesses, vulnerable groups, advocacy groups, and just more groups, environmental advocacy groups. So I found that really interesting and seeing how that could benefit and reflect Detroit very well.
For Traverse City, they also have two different plans, their climate action plan and more of a mitigation adaptation plan. you can see they have some start and some mention for water and local things as far as their equity-centered actions, but they were the first city in Michigan to become all green. So it makes sense that their main focus and main important part for equitability is with their energy security, because they have had such a high focus on that. And then as far as what their diversity and inclusion was, it was definitely more just included for their kind of local and more official areas that would be able to participate. So we're hoping that in the future they would be able to include more of the indigenous groups there, because there are quite a few different bands of indigenous groups that would be able to provide a lot of input as far as what they can include for equitability and for more renewable and sustainable actions. As far as their adaptation plan, you kind of have a similar focus for their city planning services, for their diversity and inclusion, but there still is more as far as their residents and associations, which could be for their indigenous groups. And then with the city adaptation plan, there's definitely more of a spread for water resource quality, because it's right on the lake and is a really important factor as far as their environment and how then they can include more groups in their equitability.
Yeah, going back to Traverse City, sorry, it was also very interesting to discuss with other people and analyze the plan and seeing how they don't have a lot of efforts being put forth in including their indigenous populations. It seems like they're primarily focusing on, you know, building up their city individually outside of other vulnerable and minority groups within the area.
Mhm.
And right here we have the Marquette Climate Action Plan. That's what CAP stands for. Their diversity, inclusion, and equity-centered actions, they're both pretty small again. However, that number 4 for the colleges and universities, Marquette has Northern Michigan University, and they also had assistance from Michigan State University for creating their climate action plan, which was very interesting to see how that affected the way their plan was structured. But they focus a lot on residential associations, city planning services, and as for their equity-centered actions, they're mostly just focusing on education, health and wellness, food, and a couple other things in the plan, but nothing too notable.
Ann Arbor was a really interesting plan to read because they had a really strong focus for waste management, and as they had public composting and recycling, and that took up a lot of portion of that they were talking about, which is really cool to incorporate that to the public versus it being just encouraged for small groups. And they also, of course, have a lot towards more of the wellness side of the city because of the demographic. There is Ann Arbor is the center for University of Michigan, so they have a lot of the demographic and population that are more of the college age students. So it makes sense to have more housing security, transportation and modality of multimodality of mobility, and then the energy decarbonization. So it really shows what kind of their focus is based on who is in the city there. And then with their diversity and inclusion, because again, they have the college in the university with U of M there, they have a lot of focus on that, and it shows that they got before being able to include that into their plan there, as well as the city planning services and including the local processes. And then the social justice advocacy groups were all very well included in their plan.
As for the East Lansing Sustainability Plan, again, it's a smaller area within Michigan, a lot more smaller than Lansing as a whole. However, they still had a lot of equity-centered actions and diversity inclusion efforts for the size of their city. They're focusing a lot on energy security, decarbonization, and their nature-based services, more or less just creating things a little bit more efficient for their community. And as for the diversity inclusion, they're implementing schools, the city planning services, and local elected officials within it.
Okay, so then for Royal Oak, what this one was also kind of interesting because Chicago and Royal Oak were the only ones that actually touched on all points. Chicago had much more inclusion for equity-centered actions, but for Royal Oak, you can see that they're looking at including all of it and at least mentioning it and having it as a starting point, and then of course can improve off of that. And then for the diversity and inclusion, it is more of focus on just their city planning services. So they have a large opportunity to include more minority groups and local and more kind of just public areas like residents and social advocacy groups.
Right here we have the funding sources. We were hoping to find a lot more information. However, we did with what we could with the time. And what we did was we created a survey and sent it out to all the planning firms, right? Yeah, essentially. And they answered back, and we found out that mostly they had state or local public funding that they used. We were expecting it to be a lot more of a variety rather than one select thing, but more or less it was just state and local funding and no external funding used for those climate action plans and adaptation plans. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the data. We're exploring how median household income, publication year, and number of percentage racial minorities are affecting the efforts and the inclusion and diversity within the plans.
Yeah, so for this one also is kind of just a table of our data for those 9 different plans, and it breaks it down into the equity-centered actions, diversity, inclusion, and then we also looked at the year that it was published, the population of the cities, what the median income was, and the percent of racial minorities. So there's quite a bit of variety, but it's also interesting to see what kind of comparison it is based on the size of the city. So this graph here shows the publication year compared to the diversity and equity in the city. So it is definitely more of a positive and a linear trend versus where the more recent climate action plans are more inclusive and more diverse, especially for as you get into Chicago and Ann Arbor that were the most recent, even though or Royal Oak in Chicago and Ann Arbor was still the most for diversity and equity. You can see that that's become more of a common topic and being more included in planning.
So right here we have the percentage of racial minorities. This graph is really interesting to analyze because, as you can see, Detroit is a big outlier. They have the highest percentage of racial minorities. And honestly, that really reflects their diversity and inclusion efforts that they're putting forth. Chicago reflects more of like a medium, well-rounded point of view. They're in the middle. They're also in the middle for racial minorities, but they're still putting forth a lot of good effort. And then as you can see with the rest of the little dots in the left corner, those are Traverse City for both their climate action plan adaptation, Marquette, East Lansing, and I believe Royal Oak, which was very interesting to see how their diversity and inclusion efforts reflected the percentage of racial minorities within their communities. So very low diversity, very low percentage of racial minorities.
Then we were looking also at kind of a comparison and hypothesizing that cities that had higher median income would potentially have a more diverse and equitable and inclusive plan because they would have potentially more funding from a more affluent area, but it doesn't really show as much of a trend as I thought that it would. And potentially this is because of the reason we didn't find just a variety of funding. It was more just based from state and local funding rather than it being like public or private funding. So even though there's definitely still kind of a cluster, it is not as much of a trend as we expected it to be.
Oh yeah. So yeah, to wrap things up, we're hoping that this information, this data, and the plans that we read and the information we've collected, it brings more awareness to these actions that city plans are putting forth in their climate action plans. And we're hoping that this awareness kind of sets a foundation for the knowledge and the actions that need to be put forth in climate action plans for the future.
So even though our focus was just on the Midwest with the 7 different cities and the readings that we did with the climate action plans and the adaptation plans, this is going to hopefully provide insight on all of those different areas that we analyzed and then be able to incorporate in more plans in the future for all over the world.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Those are our emails, and thank you so much for listening in.
I have all of those listed there if anyone has questions. Are there any questions in the Q&A?
So thank you, Hannah and Kate, for this excellent presentation. So Hannah is actually an environmental studies major, and she's about to graduate, and Kate is a geography and sustainable planning major. She's also about to graduate, and I am very excited to share that Kate has just come back from the annual conference of Association of American Geographers, where she presented this research as a poster, and Hannah is preparing the final version of this project to be presented as an oral presentation at the Association of Environmental Studies and Science. So this is very exciting. And we have about 10 minutes for the discussion before we bring Julia on the screen. So Julia, we'll see you in about 5-10 minutes. And meanwhile, please send your questions through the Q&A. So I'll be taking questions as they arrive. Your questions would really help us to improve this project even further as Hannah is getting it ready as a presentation at the ISSS in Portland, in Oregon this July. So please send us your questions, comments, suggestions, and we will just answer them in the order as they are received. So Q&A, you can also use chat, but it's always better to send them through the Q&A. While we are waiting for the questions from the audience, I probably will just request a little bit of clarification. So when we saw your results for Traverse City, very, very interesting results. And I noticed that you mentioned about Traverse City adaptation plan. You really meant the adaptation study, right? So that's probably why we saw much less goals related to inclusion, because it was more an academic study with the help of the University of Michigan. It was not necessarily, like the plan in the same sense, like plans of some other cities, right?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. It was not as much a focus of a plan, but more of just looking at the study of what they have so far. So it was clear to see kind of for Chicago and for Traverse City how the different plans and the different focuses ended up with kind of different grades for the rubric that we had.
Great. And so another clarification also for the methodology on funding. Yeah, Hannah, and you really designed this methodology, and I learned a lot from you, right? When you put together this wonderful survey that we send to all the we actually send them to all the city planning departments, right? So those were all the authors of the plans, or like the major officials who were engaged in the development of the plans. That was quite a disappointment for us, right? Because we were hoping to find more evidence on their engagement of philanthropy, on the engagement of private foundations in supporting those climate adaptation plans. And we found, I think, only one plan that has received some funding, and looks like everything else came from mostly from state funding or just the city funding itself.
Yeah, that definitely was a surprise. We were looking at finding out how that really impacted, and we're thinking that more funding from maybe private foundations and more federal foundation funding would lead to a more well-rounded plan, but there wasn't even that much from as far as the examples that even used those kinds of funding, so we weren't really able to compare that.
So what's next to you? So what do you have learned from this project? How would you like to apply whatever you have experienced through this opportunity of work with Johnson Center, where you're going to take, I guess, the outcomes of this project in your future careers as you're graduating from GSU?
Well, you want to go? You're fine. Okay. I'm considering when I move out to Montana, reaching out to the city department and seeing what their sustainability office is like there, because I know they have one. I don't know if they have any positions available, but to see if they would be open to, if they have an open position, or if they would be willing to start maybe an internship, and how I could kind of incorporate the stuff that I've learned into maybe helping them with the next step for that in Bozeman, Montana.
Yeah, for me, I really hope to bring more awareness about this, because it was really interesting to see how cities could or could not include certain actions and efforts within their plans, and it really shows their priorities. And I'm going to pursue my master's degree in architecture in the fall, and maybe even another degree in urban and regional planning as well. We're still figuring it out. But I hope to apply what I learned from this to that, because even though it's a lot more of a smaller scale of efforts, it can still be, there are components within the city that reflect how the city is going to function and operate. And I kind of just as I'm working with city officials and other people, I just want to see what their efforts are, and essentially bring more awareness to the stuff we learned in this too, my prior education.
Well, thank you, ladies, for sharing this very exciting plans. And I'm also excited to share that Hannah and Kate are working right now on their first academic publication. So they're planning to publish this research with my support at Michigan Journal of Sustainability under the University of Michigan, and we are preparing the manuscript. And I wish you best with this project. So thank you again for presenting at the Student Scholarship Day. I will see you this afternoon for our planning meeting. And we now have about 3 minutes just for a pause and transition to the next speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elena.
Bye-bye. So we just have a couple of minutes for the transition for the next presentation to set up the screen for Julia Shreve, and her presentation is going to start at 10:30. So in a couple of minutes. And Julia, whenever you are ready, if you want already to start testing, sharing of your PowerPoint presentation, we can do it, and we will start promptly at 10:30. This looks wonderful.
I got it on myself.
This is great, yes. So as some of you are leaving and some of you are just arriving in the audience, I want to remind you that this is a Student Scholar Day Virtual Climate Change Student Symposium 2023. This is now an annual event, and we have just concluded the first presentation by Kate Poynter and Hannah Zylman on equitable and inclusive climate adaptation planning in Michigan. Our next presentation is by Julia Shreve on effects of anthropogenic climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. And this is about to start at 10:30. We have 2 more presentations to go after Julia's. At 11 o'clock, we would have another presentation on Australia, and that will be by Jess Goodyear, assessing the vulnerability of Australian infrastructure to climate change, reviewing the implications of infrastructure planning. And then at 11:30 to noon, we have the final presentation by Leah Anderson and Kristin Davis on their learning experience working on the documentary Climate Sisu. We had a premiere of Climate Sisu last week, and some of you probably had a chance to see it on campus. And so Leah and Kristin will talk about their experiential learning and storytelling project. With this, I'm very pleased to introduce Julia Shreve. Julia is majoring in geology, and she is this semester, she has been doing research in my class, environmental studies and geography for 12, global climate and environmental change. So this is a part of Julia's student project in GPY 112, and it's titled Effects of Anthropogenic Climate Change on the Great Barrier Reef. So Julia, thank you for tuning in, and the screen is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So, hi, my name is Julia Shreve. I will be presenting my research project on the anthropogenic effects of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. The reason why I chose this is because when I was a child, I went snorkeling, and while I was trying to be careful, the people that I was with were not so, and I saw them kicking the reefs, and it just broke my heart to see it being damaged that way. So here's my outline. I have it listed on the order of which way I will go. So I will start with my abstract and I will end with my conclusion. And I just added this graph that I found. I thought it was really interesting to see the different sectors and how they are being affected. Like the northern sector is mostly bleached, while the southern sector is a little bit less bleached. And then the next, I will be reading you my abstract. So one of the biggest and most diverse coral reef systems in the world is the Great Barrier Reef, which sits off the coast of Australia. Climate change is having huge and severe influences on the health and survival of the reef and its inhabitants. Coral bleaching and mortality are being brought by rising ocean temperatures and ocean acidification brought on by higher atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. The issue is being made worse by pollution, which is contaminating the water with dangerous chemicals and garbage. The harm to the reef is also being made worse by the growing severity and frequency of extreme weather phenomena like cyclones and hurricanes. And the effect of the Great Barrier Reef's biodiversity depends on the health of the reef. Therefore, in order to safeguard the Great Barrier Reef, it is important to cut greenhouse gases and put in place for effective adaptation strategies. And the next, I will be going over the introduction and the history behind the Great Barrier Reef, just to give you a little bit of background. The history starts off with the Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest reef system located in the Coral Sea off the coast of Australia. It spans over 1,400 miles and covers of an area of approximately 133 square miles. The earliest stage of reef formation dates back to about 20 million years ago, but due to the old age, our current reef is not the same as the original one, as sections continuously die and be replaced. This means that the actual age of the current reef is only about 6,000 to 8,000 years old. And then the reef is composed of over 2,900 individual reefs and 900 islands. The reef is a unique ecosystem that supports a diverse range of marine life, including 1,500 species of fish, 600 types of coral, and many other species of marine animals. Oh, sorry. The formation that we know of today is actually just the remnants of the sediments of the Great Dividing Range, and it is a massive mountain system. And then the methods that I used to conduct this research was a literature review. In order to investigate the effects of anthropogenic climate change on the Great Barrier Reef, a review of relevant literature was conducted. The articles were chosen based on their applicability of the subject and based on their emphasis of various facets of the problems. I read about 6 of them, and those were the ones that were basically the most important. The IPCC was also used to investigate how different variables of the Great Barrier Reef, for example, increased global temperatures about 2 degrees Celsius, will result in a roughly 10% decrease in precipitation over Australia, which will then affect the Great Barrier Reef. And then the Copernicus Global Land Service provides the biophysical products of global land services, which can be used to monitor the vegetation, the water cycle, and the energy budget of the terrestrial cryosphere. So I use that to basically tell the vegetation of Australia, and you can see that it's very barren, and that is the reason why they have such a problem with agricultural runoff. So the next is just like a little bit of background on how reefs are formed. I learned about this recently because I'm a geology major, but I thought it was really interesting. A lot of people, I feel like, don't know that the reason why they get their color is from the algae and it's not themselves. So the Great Barrier Reef was, like I said, it was formed from the Great Dividing Range. Initially, coral started forming the base around these mountains when they were still continental islands. But as the sea level rose, coral grew gradually up the mountains until they were completely submerged, leaving behind small islands, barrier reefs, and atolls that we see today. So So for instance, the Whitsunday Islands are the remnants of mountaintops that once stood tall in the region, but are now surrounded by fringing reef. So I just put this little diagram over here that you can see what it was once a volcanic island, and then it slowly subsided into the ocean, creating a fringing reef, a barrier reef, and then a barrier reef down here as well. So all the reefs, including barrier reefs, start with a single organism, a coral polyp, which is a drifting organism that expelled into the sea by its parents and then will eventually settle out onto a stationary object where it will permanently attach itself and begin its life. This is where the reef is established. So once the polyps begin to secrete calcium carbonate, which hardens to form the rigid white structure or like skeleton that shapes the coral colony, the polyps on the outer surface of the skeleton and more polyps of the species will join it, becoming one unified organism. The polyps develop a symbiotic relationship with the algae, which serves as their source of food and gives their coral their coloration. Healthy coral continue to grow at a rate about 5 to 20 millimeters per year, depending on the species, and it thrives in temperatures ranging from 21 degrees Celsius and 29 degrees Celsius. So they are pretty sensitive to temperature, which is why climate change is affecting them so greatly. Anything over 29 degrees Celsius is going to be too warm for them to grow. So my first anthropogenic change, climate change effect on the Great Barrier Reef is ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is a process through which ocean absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, causing the pH to fall and the acidity to increase. Because of this, coral reefs' inability to build their skeletons as a result of the rising acidity, growing rates are slows and the structures become weaker. This has led to extensive coral bleaching and death, along with rising sea temperatures and pollution, which has caused the Great Barrier's once vibrant and diverse ecologically to decrease quickly. Beyond the corals themselves, ocean acidification has significant negative influences on the Great Barrier Reef. Reduced coral development causes the reef's structured complexity to decline, which in turn lessens the number of habitats available for fish and other marine life. And then abundance of a variety of marine species drop as a result, which cascades across the entire system. The Great Barrier Reef's ecological health, as well as the economic prosperity of towns who depend on tourism, fishing, and leisure are both impacted by the ecosystem and species. And then the next anthropogenic change I will be talking about is agricultural runoff and pollution. Agricultural runoff and pollution can introduce excess nutrients, usually nitrogen and phosphorus, into the coastal waters of the Great Barrier Reef. These nutrients can from fertilizers, animal manure, and other agricultural activities. When these nutrients reach the reef, they cause water degradation, leading to increased turbidity, reduced light penetration, and algal blooms. They can negatively impact the health and survival of coral and other marine organisms that rely on clear, nutrient-poor waters. Runoff from agricultural lands can also carry sediment, pesticides, and herbicides into the reef waters. These pollutants can directly harm the corals by smothering them and interfering with their ability to photosynthesize. Pesticides and herbicides are also toxic to coral and other marine organisms. Additionally, elevated water temperatures resulting in climate change can trigger coral bleaching events, and the combined stress from the pollutants and higher temperatures can make the coral more vulnerable to bleaching, which result in a loss of coral cover and biodiversity. And then the last anthropogenic change I will be talking about is the tourism-related activities, such as anchoring, contacting with corals by divers and snorkelers can cause physical damage to the delicate coral colonies and other marine organisms. This can result as a loss of coral cover, as well as a disrupt of natural balance of the ecosystem. Tourism can also contribute to the pollution in form of litter and chemicals from sunscreen, as well as other waste generated by tourists. These pollution can end up in the reef waters and harm marine life. And then high level of tourism and overcrowding and congestion in certain areas of the Great Barrier Reef can lead to damage of corals and disturbance to marine life. And then so I'm going to talk about a different type of management strategies that the government has implemented and can implement to help the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has implemented a zoning plan, like I showed in the first slide. It divides it into different zoning parks with specific regulations that restrict and manage human activities. Specifically, there are no-take zones. Basically, like fishing and other extractive activities are prohibited. And then reducing pollution from agricultural runoff is also a key source of management priority for the Great Barrier Reef. There have been projects implemented to improve water quality, such as reducing sediment runoff. And then there is an invasive species called the crown of thorn starfish. They have implemented a program to reduce their populations because they are what feeds off the coral. And then continuous research and monitoring needs to be conducted to better understand the health, and collaboration with stakeholders among governments are also needed to help the Great Barrier Reef. And then the last one is the personal management strategies, just like what you personally can do. Even though it's not much, you can always reduce your carbon footprint by traveling less or traveling responsibly. Practice responsible tourism, use safe sunscreen, and support your conservation organizations and educate yourself and others. So in conclusion, as we witness the devastating events of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef, it is our responsibility to take action now to protect the precious natural wonder, to ensure the survival for the future generations. Today, we can make a difference and contribute to the preservation of the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs around the world. Thank you for your attention on this important issue. And then here are my references. Are there any questions?
Well, thank you, Julia, for this excellent presentation. It's really great to learn more about your research. And thank you also for sharing this excellent scholarly resources that you have used working on this project. So once again, I want to remind those of you who just joined us recently that all the questions can be sent through the Q&A, and you can just type them, and I will, each time bring them to the attention of Julia, and she would answer these questions with voice, but you need to send the questions, you need to type your questions. Meanwhile, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I have a question for you. So it looks like right now, what we are learning is that, especially from the recent IPCC report, in the summary synthesis report that just came out a few weeks ago, everything looks like it's pointing that, most likely, look, we are not going to experience, the good thing that we are not going to experience very significant climate change, like worst case scenario says, 8.5 degrees, but we are also, unfortunately, it's becoming clearer that we are probably not going to meet the Paris agreement targets. So looks like all the evidence, most of the modern scenario really suggest, some kind of middle ground that, we probably, our emissions would peak, somewhere within the next 10, 15 years, and they will start declining just as we are moving to renewable energy and, decarbonizing our economy. So it looks like there is some end at the end of the tunnel, but not as quickly as, many of us would like to see it. What is the future for the corals? Clearly, within the next probably 20 years, we'll continue seeing lots of ocean acidification, even with the best climate change mitigation measures. What are your thoughts? Would we be living in the world without corals? Is it very pessimistic, or there is some hope to come up perhaps with some, solutions for, helping those corals to adapt, to become more resilient? What are the studies that you found? What is really the future?
I have found that from what the programs that have been implemented just in the past 10 years, they've seen a rise in coral. So they haven't been significantly impacted by the temperatures yet because it hasn't reached that point to the threshold where they can't survive. So I think that if we are able to keep the temperature down and allow them to build more of a colony, then we are able to save them, because it's like kind of like the negative feedback loop where once something happens, it just keeps snowballing, and it just it happens, and it reduces, like reducing the coral will reduce the marine life, which will reduce the just overall ecology of the area. So I think it's important to just really educate people and then keep implementing those programs that they already have implemented. I feel like a lot of the problem is the agricultural runoff, because the turbidity, it allows the sediments to be suspended in the air, and the corals can't get the nutrients and the sunlight that they need to survive.
Great. Thank you, Julia. We have another question coming from Gwyneth. What do you think is the most valuable preservation strategy to protect the Great Barrier Reef?
I personally thought that the zoning, so the zoning plans that was implemented, it's kind of hard to see because this is a little bit of a smaller graph, but you can see right here that that they only have like a little bit of general use. Otherwise, a lot of it has a national park or it has habitat protection. So people aren't allowed to just go there on their own. They need to be taken out there by a tourist company. And I feel like they're all aware of the fact that you can't just be kicking them. You have to wear safe sunscreen. But overall, I think that the zoning, from what the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park did in 2003, is the most one. Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We have the next question from Caitlin Poynter. Super interesting. Thank you for sharing. So that's just the comment. Thank you, Kate. Any other questions? So we have just probably a few more minutes for questions and discussion. So if you do have any questions for Julia, please send them right now through the Q&A. And Julia, are you planning to continue this research beyond this class? Like, what are your goals? You mentioned that you really enjoyed snorkeling and had an opportunity to visit this area. So what's next? What are the next plans for you with this research?
I think it's super interesting just how corals use the sediment to make themselves. I always thought that was like almost like mind-boggling to me. So I definitely am interested to do more research or more like environmental sustainability programming. I think that it basically adds my environmental emphasis of geology and geology together, which I really enjoy. I like the whole biological part of it too. So I definitely am interested in it. I am more interested in doing work from far away. I don't want to go there myself unless I have like a research project or something like that. I feel like traveling and like going there, even though it would be really nice, but it probably isn't the most needed thing right now.
Wonderful. And you are graduating soon, or you're graduating next year? Soon,
Yeah,
right?
next year.
Yes.
This not this summer, but next summer I will be doing my field camp, and I'm looking to going to New Zealand. It's not Australia, but is near Australia, and I'm always interested in those southern hemisphere countries. I think it's really interesting.
This is fantastic. So what exactly is bringing you to New Zealand? Is it also a research project?
I just like how their geology, basically, it's very environmental focused as well as geology focused, because I'm trying to do both of them. I'm not really trying to go into like the oil or petroleum side of geology, even though that's where you probably make the most money. I just want to try to, make a difference and do something better and, raise awareness on climate change. I feel like a lot of people just brush it under the rug and don't really pay attention to it as much as they should.
Well, congratulations on your excellent research. I hope you would have many opportunities to continue working on corals and many other exciting research projects. So thank you for your presentation. And we have just a little bit of time before the next presentation. Our next presentation is also going to be in the same region by Jess Goodyear, who will be talking today about vulnerability of Australian infrastructure. And Jess is going to join us in about 5 minutes. So we have a little bit of time for a break. So if you want to refresh your cup of coffee, I'm going to go to refresh my cup of tea, and then we will reconvene again as soon as Jess is here in about 5 minutes. Right, so we are all back and we're perfectly on time. So we are just halfway through the virtual Climate Change Education Solutions Summit Symposium at the GVSU Student Scholar Day. We had this morning really excellent presentation by Kate Poynter and Hannah Zylman on equitable and inclusive climate adaptation planning in Michigan cities, and a presentation by Julia Shreve on effects of anthropogenic climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. And we are now moving to the second half of the symposium with 2 more presentations. And exactly at 11, just in a couple of minutes, we are going to continue with a presentation by Jess Goodyear. And his presentation, as you all can see already, is titled Assessing the Vulnerability of Australian Infrastructure to Climate Change, reviewing the implications of infrastructure planning. And then we would have one more presentation at 11:30 by Leah Anderson and Kristin Davis on climate Sisu documentary and their experiential learning and storytelling experience, working with me on filming this documentary this summer. So I am very pleased to introduce Jess. Jess Goodyear is a finance major at GVSU with a minor in sustainable urban planning. And I think this project probably more lean into sustainable planning, but I'm not sure. He has been working on this project also just as Julia, as a part of environmental studies and geography for 12th, global climate and environmental change. So this is his term research project on impacts of climate change and vulnerability of the region of his choice to climate change impacts. And Jess is our international student from Australia. So he really had a great first-hand experience to collect data on impacts of climate change on Australia. And Jess, thank you very much for being here, for sharing your research early, for being prepared, and the screen is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, as mentioned, I did study assessing the vulnerability of Australian infrastructure to climate change. The reason behind studying this, as mentioned, I am from Australia, so I have a lot of I've witnessed this firsthand a lot of the time. And also just, you always see in the news and everything, we're building bigger, better buildings, we're creating all these great things. But to me, it's always it's the simple things like just a bridge that connects one side of the river to the other that are witnessing the first-hand effects of climate change. And definitely at home, in Australia, this is a common practice where we build these things and they're not meant to be iconic. They're meant for efficiency and productivity. but these are also the same pieces of infrastructure that are struggling the most. And if these pieces of infrastructure fail, they're the ones that are going to cause great economic, social, and political harm to a country if these types of implications keep on happening. And if we're not beginning to assess the vulnerability of the infrastructure that's currently in place. So in with my introduction, I did want to quote a great Australian environmentalist and author, Tim Flannery. So Tim said, "We are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it." I thought these were very, very powerful words, especially in the time that we're in. The New York Times post that you see behind is actually titled "Global Warming Has Begun, Expert Tells Senate." The reason I found this interesting is from the date. So it was published on Friday, June 24th, 1988. And yes, that does seem a bit long ago. I wasn't born yet, but it's actually not that long ago. My oldest brother was alive at this time. So it just really brings Flannery's quote to live when you think we are the first generation and also the last to be able to do something about it, which is just very powerful. And it just hit me a lot harder than I ever would have expected. So with the discussion focus and what I've researched and found, so the discussion is going to surround the impacts of climate change on Australian infrastructure. Australian infrastructure, we do have a lot of great codes in place. So when we do build pieces like bridges, highways, anything of the sorts, they are up to a pretty high standard. But as climate change is becoming more severe and intense, when we are building these pieces of infrastructure, we have to now start assessing if these codes are still up to date with the current time. So as mentioned, these bridges that we're building, are they still up to code if sea level rise or flooding is becoming more prominent in certain areas? So are we now starting to have to build higher bridges in areas that we originally didn't think we needed to, type of thing? At home, one of the bridges that I travel on every day, it is becoming a lot more prone to flooding. And now the local government has actually implemented a new series of codes in that area. And now they're actually starting to build the bridge higher. And it is a really good thing because although it's causing disruption currently because they've had to close the road, this same road is going to be a lot better off and going to allow people to be safer traveling across it and also be not as affected from flooding and such things like that. We need the need for infrastructure planning to address climate change. I think politics does have a massive role within the infrastructure planning area when addressing climate change. Ultimately, codes that are coming from these different bodies of government need to start addressing the fact that climate change is affecting infrastructure planning. And if we're not going to be up to date with it, then how are we going to pretty much adapt to it or overcome it ultimately? So as I said here, effective infrastructure planning can help to mitigate the impacts of climate change and ensure that essential services can continue to be provided even in extreme weather conditions. Importance of assessing vulnerability. So although it seems pretty logical, yes, we need to, and we currently do it, that we need to look at the importance of assessing vulnerability, because if we're not assessing it, how do we know where it is? And currently this is already in place in Australia. Infrastructure does get assessed yearly or maybe even biannually too. So just the fact that we're doing that already is great, but with climate change occurring, climate change events occurring much more often, there is a need that maybe every time there is a severe hailstorm or maybe severe flooding or bushfires even, we need to be prepared to go and assess that right after the event has taken place. And this is not only going to make it safer for the future of infrastructure planning when we are building these new pieces, but it's also going to give us better data and understanding of what we can do in the future too. So identifying Australian climate susceptibility. So these are all very generalized topics here: heat waves, sea level rise, floods, bushfires, intensifying storms. The idea of my research wasn't to make some new profound discovery it was to pretty much make a linear path of understanding. Right now, I think there's a lot of different ways you can go, but ultimately they all lead to the same end, and it's much more linear than you'd think. So yes, if there's a flood and a piece of infrastructure, let's say a bridge, again, that same bridge I was talking about earlier, if we know this bridge is going to be susceptible to the flooding that's going to occur, then why aren't we acting beforehand? Why is that not happening? Because there's so many different routes that you have to take before being able to do it. You've got to go to your local government, which may have to go to your state government. Then you've got to find the resources in the budgets, and then everything like that. So it is a lot more intense within the system than you would think. But logically, it's as simple as this bridge is prone to flooding and it's causing chaos to the area and ultimately can cause harm to individuals if they were to try to cross it. So the idea is that this path is a lot more linear than you would think, but it's also a lot more confusing than it can be too, should be it too at times. So identifying vulnerable infrastructure. So the types of infrastructure at risk from the previous slide are things like these highways, bridges, tunnel systems, even power plants, transportation systems. All of these same pieces of infrastructure are at the same type of risk that you would see. Australia is a country that is mostly populated on the coastline. So 90% of Australians live in the coastal city areas. And unfortunately, these coastal areas are the areas that are much more prone to these climate change events. So as you can see, on the right side of there is the Sea Cliff Bridge, which is actually only located about 30 minutes from my house. And this bridge was built because, as you can kind of see on the cliff face on the side, there used to be a road there, and that's how you used to travel on this road to get around this cliff. And the authorities deemed it unsafe to travel because there was too many landslides occurring and pieces of the road were actually starting to tumble off the side of the world due to coastal erosion. So the authorities created this Sea Cliff Bridge. And the amazing thing that I found out from this bridge is that it's efficient and productive, but they were able to turn something that we needed, something that needed to be adaptable to the new climate, into something beautiful and a tourist hotspot. So it just goes to show that you can create something out of anything if you need to. And this bridge is a place that a lot of people visit now because it is so beautiful, and it's somewhat actually inspiring to show that we were able to build something like this to pretty much adapt to the effects of climate change. So as you can see on the side as well, you've got coastal infrastructure is vulnerable to sea level rise, heat waves, strain electrical grids, and there is a lot of that. I will be discussing the electrical grids in Adelaide later on in the presentation, but that is just something to be aware of. Bushfire damage to power lines, as many know, Australia is severely prone to bushfires too. So the methodology surrounding my research is not very confusing either at all. So once again, I use satellite imagery, and that's just a fancy way of almost saying I did look at Google Earth. And Google Earth is an amazing tool because I was able to see the conditions from not only the most current year, but I was actually able to go back a fair few years in certain areas to see what it kind of looked like previous to the past decade or so. And it was kind of amazing to me how much in these areas that I've been around my whole life, how much coastal degradation there has been in these areas. And it's kind of just shocking to see it, but you don't see it because I was seeing it in the long-term way. So every day I see it, it doesn't really look different to me. But if you were to compare it from a 10-year period, it looks very different. I did field surveys. So I actually was able to do a lot of the field surveys myself at home at times, because once again, this is just a topic I'm very interested in. So mentally, I'm taking note every time I am in Australia of these different areas. So when there is a severe storm causing flooding in certain areas, or when there is a massive bushfire, these are the things that I have to be aware about. And it's common knowledge to Australians that, yes, you're in a bushfire prone zone. Yes, you're in a flooding prone zone. So these are the field surveys I was kind of conducting, because it's kind of a life or death scenario almost at times. Also was able to use the IPCC, which I was able to use in class, and I only found out about this semester, and it is the best piece of technology I've come across. I think it is a great way to understand and visualize what is occurring and in the terms of climate change. And I think more people need to probably hop on this and just go around your own area and check your own area around us to see maybe what's going to occur in your area in the future, or what could potentially occur. There were interviews, so I did contact experts in the field, and they all were professors and staff in Australia, and a lot from Australia universities, which was really cool. And then after gathering all this data, I was kind of able to start structuring it all together to kind of get that understanding of, when I had all these images and all the data surrounding, I could put it all together and go, yes, this does make sense. And once again, I took the logical route and it made sense. The results will aim to conclude a better understanding of climate impacts on infrastructure and how to mitigate them by reviewing these current practices that we're going to talk about. So one of the things that I had to do was analyze climate change impacts on Australia. So once again, these climate change impacts have been occurring for many years now. I do think Australians are some of the hardest hit by climate change. We have severe bushfires, flooding every other year as well. It's kind of that El Niño effect. And unfortunately, once again, this is something that Australians have to be aware about, because life or death situations are coming with these different climate events now. So temperature is a severe one. Once again, heat waves, yes, it's very hot. So what do? We turn the air conditioner on, and that very heavily strains the energy grid. Just to put into a visual, the image on the left is actually a schoolgirl in a school uniform in Australia. Yes, we wear uniforms like that. A lot of people kind of get a giggle, but I think it's just normal. But what that image is showing is that you'd think this is something from the future. Why do we need fans shooting water out onto you whilst you're at like a school event or at school? Well, this is currently what we have to do now. This is the future pretty much that we're living in, that we have to have these types of resources implemented in school areas just to make sure that students and faculty and all that aren't suffering from heat stroke or just overall headaches and everything from the severe heat that is happening. So just something to keep in mind, that these events are occurring much more intensely than you would kind of expect. Then we had to also look at the precipitation patterns. So once again, droughts can also lead to water shortages and put pressure on water infrastructure. Australia has very good water infrastructure in place. We have desalination plants, we have dams, and we're very water efficient in our ways. So we do have times where we can't water our lawns, where we can't fill up the pool or anything like that. And an interesting thing is, when there is a bushfire, the Royal Bushfire Service automatically has the right to take water from people's backyard swimming pools to fight off the fires that may be close in the area. So that just goes to show that we are water efficient, we're prepared for these events, but as they intensify, are we really prepared? That's when we have to start assessing. There's more images and more things to assess. Was sea level rise and extreme weather events. So to the left, you can see these hailstones the size of golf balls and even baseballs. These can do some severe damage to infrastructure. So power lines get destroyed by this, people's cars. Even if this piece of ice were to come down at a good enough speed, it could almost break a brick in half. So these are definitely things that you have to be aware about now. My dad is a builder and he specializes in the skylight business. So he gets a lot of business after a hailstorm because of these hailstones coming through. But the business he now works for is trying to innovate to build a skylight that can pretty much hold off severe hailstorms. And they're currently going through it. They've got some skylights that can almost do it, but when a hailstone the size of the one on the left comes down, it can't hold up to that. So that just goes to show we are trying to innovate with Australian infrastructure planning and everything like that. But obviously, you got to learn from these events and keep just going back to the blueprints on the board, pretty much. So evaluating Australian policy and governance frameworks. So Australia previously wasn't a country that, let's just say Australian in terms of the government, we don't have that much put into climate change and everything like that. Until recently, we have definitely changed our ways. But Australia, obviously one of our major exports is coal and iron ore and everything like that. So as soon as you say we need to stop exporting coal and we need to stop using coal, that does put a lot of strain on the economy, and a lot of people do get fears from it. But the Australian government over the past few years has started to see that we can no longer keep up with the severe events that climate change is putting us through. And so we are now committing to net zero by 2050 and all that. So this is something that I'm very happy that the Australian government has started to implement with policy. And as I said, Australians are very hard hit individuals in terms of climate change. So that is why the Australian government and the people are starting to become a lot more climate focused, which is a really interesting thing that I think. And as you can see, I've kind of just labeled up here. You can also read the under each, but up here you got the understand, identify, engage, develop, establish. I kind of came up with these on my own to kind of say, this is the process that the Australian policies that are coming into place, that the Australian government is putting into their frameworks. This is kind of the way that they're taking. So I'm not sure if other governments kind of go along this kind of a route, but this is how I identified the policies that I was reading and how they were going about them via that kind of a way. So as you can see, understanding existing policy governance frameworks in Australia, identify gaps and opportunities. So I think that's the biggest one is with that Sea Cliff Bridge, for example, we identified the issue and then we made it turn into an opportunity. We can create something beautiful, something that tourist and a tourist hotspot and everything like that. So that's definitely something to be aware about. Then engage with stakeholders. So you don't have to purely fund these things from a governance standpoint. A lot of individual corporations are now seeing that there is opportunities in investing in renewable energy and infrastructure that can hold up better under new climate events. Develop strategies for improvement as well as establish metrics for progress. So adapting infrastructure to climate change. So there are several elements that you have to be aware of and that I became aware of undertaking this research. So retrofitting was a big one. So retrofitting its existing infrastructure to make it more durable. That's one of the biggest ones that will have to be undertaken because I understand it would cost a lot, and I mean a lot of money to go to every piece of infrastructure, take it down and rebuild it. But we can retrofit these pieces of infrastructure to make them more durable. In Australia, a lot of the seawalls that we're currently building, we're currently now putting these molded coral pieces, attaching them to these seawalls and allowing the local ecosystem to grow on these fake pieces of molded coral. And by doing this, it's actually making these seawalls more durable, which is a really, really interesting thing that I found. And I have seen it in places, but I wasn't aware that's what the design was meant for at home. But now after doing this research, I'm aware of this, and it's kind of like, it didn't impact me at all. I didn't notice it. I didn't feel like it detracted from the area. It made the area more beautiful, if anything. So once again, you can make these pieces of infrastructure much more resilient while also much more appealing. Designing the infrastructure with climate change in mind, that's just a very obvious one, but something that needs to be done. Diversifying, so water sources in Australia, once again, we're very water efficient, but when a severe drought comes, as we saw in 2019, 2020, we do need to start beginning to diversify where we can get our water from, because turning on a desalination plant is very costly, and it's also not sometimes the most efficient route to take. But we are taking other ways. So we have the Snowy Hydro scheme built in the 1930s. This Snowy Hydro scheme is built in the Snowy Mountains of Australia and is a massive water resource for the local area, as well as the state of New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. And with this, we are now building the Snowy Hydro Scheme 2.0, which is meant to make out this resource more efficient and more abundant. So we are preparing by diversifying these water resources and then relocating. So relocating critical infrastructure away from high-risk areas. So with my house and my area, I live right next to a place called the Royal National Park, and it is an area that is very susceptible to bushfires and everything. And although you can't relocate all the families, all the households and everything that live in that area, what we've started to do is actually just make about a 5 to 10 meter gap between the main road and housing to the tree lines, just so fires can't jump as easy in those areas. But what else is occurring now is that we are moving housing away from these critical areas. If you're in a flood-prone area, you can't build there as easily anymore without permits and such, because the government and the local government know that this area will be dangerous for you and your family if you were to try to live there. So although it is impacting people, some people more than others, it is for all the better for everybody ultimately. So in conclusion, addressing climate change impacts is crucial for infrastructure planning in Australia. Australia is definitely that prone country that we all see. We saw the unfortunate scenes of kangaroos on the ground that were burnt to death, and it was horrible. And then we see families having to get on little tinny boats to get back to safety from the roof of their house with kids crying because they don't know what's happening. So we have to start planning for these things to, like, as if they were going to occur just naturally, because the more increasing the climate change becomes, the more increased these issues are going to come and more harm will occur. But with infrastructure in place that can prepare for this, we can be more prepared. So not building in these flood-prone areas, not building critical infrastructure in these flood-prone areas. And ultimately, as much as that may occur to some people, and many of the Australian people are prepared to make these sacrifices, because we no longer can live in a state where we are just accepting that a fire can come and take the house on a hot summer's day, or that when a really bad rainstorm hits, that a hailstone can just come through and fly through a skylight, ultimately could hit somebody in the house or that's outside of that house. So ultimately, strategies for climate change adaptation and mitigation, such as retrofitting and diversifying water sources, can help ensure infrastructure resilience. So building these ecosystem molded type coral molds to seawalls is a great way to do this. By taking action to adapt infrastructure to climate change, Australia can continue to support economic and social development. So one of the biggest things that I took away, and this probably is the finance accounting major in me coming out, is that if we don't prepare for this, Australia is not just going to be worried about climate change, but the country's social and economical wealth is going to be in severe harm's way. So this is all just things that we have to start preparing for, and by mitigating the effects of climate change on infrastructure, we can start to be more comfortable and producing more. And ultimately, this is something we're going to have to do anyway. So why not start now? So that is the end of my presentation. If anyone has questions.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you for your really outstanding presentation, beautiful illustrations, so many great ideas. Actually see that we have lots of questions coming to your way. So I will start by the questions from the audience, and then I also have a few questions. So I have a question from Caitlin Poynter. What do you believe is the best ways of spreading awareness for the situation at hand? It appears that people notice the issue, but what do you personally think would work to get people to take action to bring more awareness to fixing these issues?
So unfortunately for myself, and as I mentioned, a lot of Australians in general, we had to become aware firsthand, because in 2019, 2020, for example, I woke up at around 11 p.m. with my mum shaking me saying, "Jesse, we need to go." And my brothers and I all got in the car, and my mum drove away, and we went to my mum's house. and my dad stayed back with the garden hose. And as stupid as that was, like, unfortunately, that's what a lot of the people were doing in the area, but my mum wasn't taking the chance. So we got in the car and went away, and becoming aware about the situation at hand was as simple as that moment in time. So many people, Sydney City and the surrounding area has about several million people living in that area. So all these people, even if they weren't in harm's way from bushfires or floods, you have the smoke that is taking over the area, so causing lung issues. And in flooding, you have people not being able to get to their households and everything, or their places of work because of this. So I think, and once again, a lot of people in the US saw what happened in Australia. I always think about the time somebody had a video in Australia in like the more rural lands, and he was just walking onto a farm that had been hit by the fires, and there were sheep dead on the ground everywhere, but there were sheep still alive, but they were burnt to a crisp. And you know that it would have been better off being put down. But unfortunately, at that time, there was no way we could get resources to those areas. So I think events that happen around the world just need to be not just saying, oh, severe bushfires in Australia, or in California, for example, severe flooding in Michigan. I think we need to start saying that, like, these events are severe, and that's what they're called, floods, bushfires. But I think we need to start saying climate change, this is going to occur more. And the current route that we're doing it needs to be much more efficient and productive. I understand net zero by 2050 is a great idea and everything, but we need more policies in place. We need to start accepting that we need to give up some of the leisures in life to be able to live life ultimately.
And this is so true. And yes, as you say, like even if we reach net zero by 2050, many negative impacts of climate change would continue building up. We already have these emissions in the atmosphere. So even with the best climate change mitigation policies, it's really important to be prepared and recognize that we would experience more and more negative effects of climate change, and we need to learn how to live with them. So I had a question for you. So how do you see, you lived both in the United States and in Australia. Do you see any differences in the way how, government is taking responsibility on assessment of human vulnerability? You mentioned that it's absolutely essential to conduct vulnerability assessment, because in order to know what to protect and how to adapt, we first need to understand what are vulnerabilities, and also how climate change adaptation is organized, and if you see any differences again between what you're experiencing here in Michigan and what you have experienced at home in Australia.
So one of the biggest things that I've thought about is, and I will never forget, it will never leave me, when those bushfires were happening in Australia, those really severe bushfires, like the country was just burning to a crisp. Grand Valley went online for a week because of such a severe polar vortex hitting that if you're outside longer than 10 minutes, there was issues for frostbite coming about. So I just, like, you look at these two incredible extreme weather events occurring, and it's just something that always will stay with me forever, because it's, wow, like people in Michigan are saying to me, this is the worst they've ever seen it. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's crazy. Like, I'm here during this. And then my mum's on the other side calling me saying, this is so incredibly bad and so dangerous. Like, I can't believe that we're living through this right now. And it was just interesting. Like, it was kind of like, it allowed me to see both sides of the spectrum. And unfortunately, so many people probably don't get the opportunity almost to be able to talk to someone in such a faraway country that has people, relatives seeing this and then experiencing the other side on their own. And then a lot of people from Michigan always say to me, like, oh, the weather is so much warmer this time of year. It's so weird. Or like the winters are getting shorter and all that kind of thing. And it's just, it's amazing that you think to yourself, you're like, well, this is it. like you got to put the name to it now, and it's as simple as just saying now this is the effects of climate change. This is what we're going to have to start expecting. And I think from what I've actually witnessed in the US, I think a lot of people are very well aware that climate change is happening, and I think there's a lot of wanted action from the government. And I feel like the governments of the US and Australia all around, I think they are starting to answer now, which is great, which is why we see that climate summits happening and everything around that. And I think in terms of Australia, we are starting to give up something that makes us such a plentiful country. Like, we're labeled the lucky country, and ultimately we're labeled that because we have such an abundance of these resources that are the same things that are almost killing us, you know? So yes, we can keep digging for this coal, but we got to understand that this is the same thing that is hurting us. But one of the big things that I always think about is Australia's got such an abundance of land that you look at, we could put solar panels on, or we could create such new ways of renewable energy that would ultimately make us such a resourceful country once again, if we were to stop utilizing other ways such as coal or fossil fuels.
Well, thank you, Jess. And we have one more comment from the audience. Wonderful presentation. It is obvious that you are passionate about this topic, and it is inspiring. Keep up the good work. And I only want to second this statement. I really enjoyed very much working with you this semester on this project. I absolutely admire your research. We have learned a lot from you today. So thank you very much for participating in the Student Scholar Day. And we will, of course, share your presentation. I am recording it, and it will be available at the Student Scholar Day website. Congratulations again, and best of luck with your continuous research.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We are about to move forward now to our next presentation, and our last presentation today is going to be at 11:30, which is right now, by Leah Anderson and Kristin Davis. And Leah and Kristin will talk about their experiential learning and storytelling, working on the Climate Sisu documentary this summer. So both Kristin and Leah have recently graduated from GVSU. So Kristin is already here, and she graduated very recently in December 2022 with major in film and video, and she is just starting her career as a filmmaker. And I'm very proud of her work on Climate Sisu. Leah graduated from Geography and Sustainable Planning Department and Environmental Studies. She was actually our first double major between Geography and Environmental Studies, focusing on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience planning. And she came back as a promised student this summer to take a class on GIS. And that also created an opportunity for her to engage with the Climate Sisu project. So Climate Sisu, some of you had a chance to see their premiere showing, the test premiere on campus last Thursday downtown. And I think this event was quite successful thanks to great work of Kristin and Leah. Leah is, I think she's not here yet, but she is joining us all the way from the University of Denver. So she graduated from Grand Valley, and she started this fall her graduate program in environmental policy at the University of Denver. And I believe she is about to join us. She is joining us on the screen right now. So Leah and Kristin, welcome to GVSU Student Scholar Day. Thank you very much for sharing your work. Your presentation is somewhat different. This is really a great example of creative excellence, not only research. Our first three presentations were more focusing on research. Your presentation is really showcasing your creative project. with this, welcome back to Grand Valley, and the screen is yours.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm a little bit late. I clicked on the wrong link, so I wasn't a panelist. I was just viewing it. But I can go ahead and share my screen really quick. And then we can get started. Okay. Maybe if Kristin wants to share it, it's not working in my settings currently.
Okay, let me see if I can pull it up.
Sorry about that. It's been a long time.
And if you guys need any help, you both have, you can even do multiple participants can share. But if you are experiencing any difficulties, you can also send me your slide, and I can share them for you as well. So just let me know if you need any help. But it looks like it's sharing perfectly well. Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
of course.
Perfect. Thanks.
Perfect. Of course. Okay. Yeah, so this is our presentation, basically what Elena said on Climate Sisu, which is the documentary that we worked on this past summer. And then I also worked on it up until around the premiere of it, which was a few days ago.
Yes.
If interruption, your screen is still loading. So right now I only see loading.
Okay.
Do you see your screen? It showed up and then it disappeared, and right now I just see loading. So I don't know if it's a connection issue. Maybe you can just try again.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, now it's
Okay.
yes, it's here. Wonderful. Thank you.
Of course.
So like Kristin introduced, this is Climate Sisu. So a little bit of background for me. I graduated from Grand Valley in 2020. I graduated with a bachelor's in geography and environmental studies. For Climate Sisu specifically, I was co-producer, research assistant, and I helped narrate as well.
Yeah, and then for me, again, as Elena mentioned, I graduated this past December in 2022 with a film and video degree. And I've worked on a few Grand Valley film productions. And then for Climate Sisu specifically, I was the videographer and the editor.
So I'll talk a little bit about the Climate Change Education Solutions Network. So we launched in May of 2018 by a group of GVSU faculty, specifically Elena, and others as well, students, staff, teachers from all over West Michigan. And I became a part of the network in, I believe it was the beginning of 2019. So early on, I was one of the first research assistants, and then I've been lucky to work on various things over the past couple of years. But I actually came back to Michigan from Colorado this past summer to work on Climate Sisu specifically. And I'm so lucky to have been a part of it again. But who we are, group of faculty, students, scientists, teachers, anyone really passionate about student-centered and solution-oriented climate change education for all ages. And really what we want to do with the network is create this sense of community and create this forum for dialogue and collaboration to really have these solution-oriented climate change education for all ages. So we really want to just create this community and hold a dialogue. And with that came Climate Sisu. And if you want to go to the next slide, Kristin. Thank you. Climate Sisu is a collection of stories told by, again, like this community that we created with activists, students, educators, and more. And it really starts at Grand Valley and takes you all the way up to northern Michigan. So we went to Traverse City, Leelanau Peninsula, and Marquette. And for me, this was very special because I'm from Marquette. So when Elena first told me that we would be traveling to the UP, it just made the whole thing even more of a passion project for me. And it was really lovely to be able to show Kristin and Elena my hometown, and then also connect with new people in Marquette and hear their stories as well. So the stories that we collected was really knowledge about climate action, resilience, adaptation, and education. And we visited a number of organizations, such as Inland Seas was, I believe, one of the first ones that we visited in Leelanau Peninsula. And what they do is they have a sailboat, which was a cool experience in itself for anybody, but their goal is to take students onto this boat and create experiential learning and place-based learning around Great Lakes stewardship and science. And what they want to do is then tie this into climate resiliency once they create this sense of stewardship. And it's really the connection of the place and the learning that makes it very special for students. So being able to capture that within the movie was really cool as well. So that was just one organization. We also visited a vineyard, which is a cool story surrounding climate change, because oftentimes you don't really think about how wine is going to be impacted. We visited Northern Michigan University, Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities in Traverse City, talked to a number of people from there, professors from NMU, like I stated before, and then a couple other places in Marquette as well. So it really is a collection of these stories, and it's very special to see it come about. So.
Yes, and then also to touch on like climate Sisu. So before we even kind of thought about making the documentary, we were like going to these places to also like complement an online curriculum. So when we were going there, we kind of found these stories of like climate resiliency and stuff like that. And so that's kind of how the documentary blossomed into this.
Yeah, it really was a whole project. It was originally supposed to be more like short stories, but after hearing all of these stories and interviewing all of these amazing people, it really, like Kristin said, blossomed into something bigger. And in my opinion, it's just the outcome is amazing. It was really great to see it come together. But what inspired us came when we were in Marquette. Sisu is very prevalent. It's a Finnish concept meaning extraordinary determination, courage, and resolution in the face of adversity. And for me, I am from Marquette, so I grew up with this concept of Sisu. There's a big Finnish background in the Upper Peninsula, specifically in the Keweenaw, so way up north. But Sisu for me really meant this inner strength. So when thinking about climate change and how it applies to activism, what we wanted to do is shift the narrative of gloom and doom and fear when it comes to impacts. Oftentimes we hear a lot about, the world's going to set on fire, our glaciers are melting, there's going to be climate refugees, which is true, but we wanted to shift that narrative to a more hopeful approach that inspires change and really inspires people to keep moving. Because a lot of times I think you hear too that people just want to shut down because they're like, the world's going to set on fire anyways. Why should we do anything? So when we heard of Sisu as a concept for climate resiliency, it just made sense to title the documentary that. Because we do have this inner strength and we have this motivation to find these solutions. So that is where that concept came from.
Mm-hmm. And this theme like really resonated a lot with me too, since I don't come from like a geography or environmental sustainability background. So the more I got into CCESN and editing their videos and stuff like that, it kind of also too shifted my narrative away from the doom and gloom. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch on while I was like editing, and just allowing these people who are experts in what they do and who are activists every day to share their stories rather than the stories that we normally hear of like fear and we should be scared and we all have to like put our all into saving the world, when all these like little things that each and every one of us do really does add up. So yeah. And then we do have a video link for our trailer if no one has seen didn't get the chance to see Climate Sisu, so I can play that for you guys. Oh, 1 second.
I'm like, hopefully it all works.
Yes, let's try that again. Okay.
No, you could probably copy and paste it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't work, I'm sure we could just put the link like in the chat for people.
Mm-hmm. I think I might have to share this screen. Okay, here we go.
Thanks.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Perfect.
You want just to click on play? If you just click on this little triangle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys see it on screen right now?
Yes. All you need to do is just click on play.
Okay.
Yeah.
It might be loading, I think, because
I
it's
see.
playing on my screen.
Okay.
Let's see.
And again, if it doesn't work,
Yeah.
then we can just post the link too.
Mhm. Yes. I think that might work a little bit better, probably. Let's see.
But yes, for everyone watching, definitely go and watch the whole documentary because it's pretty great. And I just want to say that I'm pretty proud of our team of 3 here to put all of this together in one summer. It really was like a passion project for all of us, and I'm proud to be a part of it. So.
Yeah. So that was the end of our presentation. I'll put the link in the chat for anyone that wants to see it.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Kristin and Leah, for your great presentation and fantastic work on this project. And I know that this project is continuing. There was a very successful internal premiere last week, and we continue working. You know, Kristin is continuing putting the very final touches on the documentary, getting it ready for several film festivals and for further sharing and further disseminations. So could you share a little bit about like what you have learned from working on this project, and where would you like to go from there, and what are your future plans, either along your work on Climate Sisu or also, you know, perhaps in your future projects, and where you would take this learning experience?
Yeah, so I can start. Again, for me, like I have a background in geography and environmental studies, and I've been working with the network since 2019. So for me, I had less of like the doom and gloom focus, but my goal with Climate Sisu was to be able to share that with people. And one of our interviewees in the documentary, Jess Thompson, she is amazing at articulating this, but really having that connection and providing that connection for people allows them to shift that narrative. And so for me, what I wanted to do with the documentary was have all of these stories and really inspire people and bring everyone together to foster that collaboration, rather than, you know, having a short film about all of the impacts that are going to happen and the science behind it. Because a lot of people don't connect with the science and data. There's a lot of jargon with it. And again, if you don't have the background, then it might not even really mean anything to you. Or you might have the perspective of, well, I might as well give up because I guess we're all going to fall apart anyways. So I think really putting that message out there that there is hope, and you'll see me talk about it in the film, that inspires me personally. And I want to take that mindset with me in my career, because I do plan on continuing in the field of environment, sustainability, and climate resiliency. So really having that collaboration and building that network wherever I am, and right now I'm Colorado, that's really important to me. And I want to be able to share Climate Sisu specifically across the US and have it be an inspiration for other people who might want to create like a similar network to our network. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, for me, I think the most memorable part that keeps coming to mind of the documentary is when one of the groundworks people, who was Carolyn Alstead, when she was explaining how the story about how people, I guess people that don't believe in climate change and stuff like that, or they're like climate deniers, how they talk about it, but in reality, like the things that we do to make climate change, like to, I guess, to be more resilient against climate change, those things are bettering us anyways, like no matter what. And so I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, because it's helping more than just the like, I guess, the fight against climate change and making our world better. It's also helping communities, and it's helping people, and it's helping things to be more accessible. And so I think messages like that really hit me and resonated with me. And I'm not really a documentary like filmmaker, but this definitely taught me a lot. And I'll definitely take the things that I learned from doing like videography and editing with me in my career. So yeah.
This is fantastic, and it was such a great, rewarding experience for me working with you. And this was the very first experience in my life working on any kind of video, you know, besides recording my own video lectures. And so I have actually learned so much from you both. It was such a pleasure working with you. So, you know, you really were able to articulate, both of you were able to articulate very successfully, I think, in Climate Sisu, this need for shifting perspective, shifting the narrative from fear to action, you know, from focusing only on problems and impacts to solutions for climate change. And I think that was very much the theme of the entire session that we are having today at the Student Scholarship Day, because you also saw earlier research presentations, right? We just had this excellent presentation by Jess Goodyear, focusing on climate adaptation in infrastructure building in Australia. And we saw, you know, great presentation by Hannah and Kate on climate adaptation and equity and diversity and inclusion in climate adaptation in Michigan. And then, of course, Julia Shreve's presentation on the need to protect the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So, you know, we see many examples of action-driven projects and solutions for climate change. Yet it is a very real issue, right? And, you know, mitigation is very important. And those worries and fears, you know, they are justified because, you know, the extreme events are here and they're affecting more and more people and are creating really very difficult, you know, sometimes unlivable conditions in many parts of the world. So where do you see this balance between, on one hand, you know, recognizing the very significant impact of climate change on you know, our generation, especially on your generation and the generations to come. But on the other hand, really bringing everybody into action and allowing them to focus optimistically on solution and knowing that solutions are here and the solutions would come. And despite all the seriousness of climate change, we can adapt, we can be resilient. So what it means for you, and again, what was your experience working with Climate Sisu in shifting perhaps your own narrative on climate change?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the fear and doom and gloom, I don't think that's to say that we should ignore impacts, but there's a way to go about it that inspires people rather than kind of deflates you, you know? And for me, one of those kind of defining moments where I saw it in action was at Inland Seas and their emphasis on kids in a classroom. They learn and they can see the data, but they might not connect with it and take it with them throughout their careers, throughout the rest of like their education. But when you bring them on the boat, then they're learning about place-based, and they're actually on the water and they're seeing the little bugs that they catch, and that sticks with them. And then they're essentially stewards of the Great Lakes, and then stewards of the environment, and then stewards of climate resiliency as well. It all ties in together. So I think reframing it and having that emphasis on connection and experiential learning is really important. And then taking that with you is very helpful. But again, it's not to say that we should ignore impacts, but there's a time and a place to really emphasize the impacts rather than, you know, just trying to create this connection. And that's our goal with the network, is to create the dialogue. And our goal with Climate Sisu was to really show these stories to inspire others. So I think that's the key element in finding solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I definitely know that climate change is a lot worse in other places. Like, we are definitely lucky to be living like in the United States, in Michigan, with all these like Great Lakes around us and stuff like that, where we're not getting like the huge like major effects. But I think that if there's more videos out there that kind of emphasize on like floodings, wildfires, like ice sheets, all that kind of stuff, it really discourages people instead of trying to make them take action. And it also too makes people, I guess it makes people think, from my experience, that we have to make these like huge changes in order to, like, you know, flip climate change on its head. But when you focus on these like communities such as like Inland Seas in Traverse City and Marquette and stuff, it's really the small things that people are doing that's changing, like, I don't know, it's changing perspectives, and it's changing the way that we can do things. So yeah, I think it's a good middle ground.
Yeah, I agree with you, Kristin. And again, I want to emphasize like this collective action. I think people, when it comes to even sustainability too, they think, oh, well, I'm just one individual, like how much I can do. But when you put it together, it makes a really big difference. And of course, like policy and international agreement, those are all very important. But when you put together all of these people doing amazing work, it does make a difference. And it creates a more positive and efficient community too, like Carolyn Alston was talking about. So there's a lot of benefits to having this more positive outlook rather than just focusing on the fear itself.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Leah and Kristin, for this excellent presentation and for your great work on Climate Sisu. So I strongly recommend everybody to watch it as soon as, you know, we will be showing it again this summer in Traverse City, and hopefully it will be back again on campus in Grand Valley and eventually also online. So this really concludes our virtual climate change student symposium at GVSU Student Scholar Day. If you joined later, I wanted to remind that we have heard today from Kate Poynter and Hannah Zylman on equitable and inclusive climate adaptation planning in Michigan, from Julia Shreve on effects of anthropogenic climate change on the Great Barrier Reef, from Jess Goodyear on assessing the vulnerability of Australian infrastructure to climate change, reviewing implications of climate change on infrastructure planning. And finally, we had a great conversation about climate Sisu documentary storytelling experience with Leah Anderson and Kristin Davis. So this webinar, of course, was recorded, and you would see it very soon on the website of Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, and also Climate Change Education Solutions Summit. And thank you very much for showing up, and have a wonderful day. Bye.